Ashenmere Betrayed. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore had spent years navigating the dangerous web of court politics. But when Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's silent enforcer, caught her slipping a message into the wrong hands, she felt the weight of his gaze. "You think you are clever, my lady," he murmured. "But tell me, do you truly understand the game you are playing?" Chapter 1. The Serpent's Whisper. The air in the Queen's solar hung thick with the scent of beeswax and impending doom. Lady Emmeline of Dunmore traced the intricate embroidery of a hunting scene on her lap, her needle a silver dart flashing in the afternoon light filtering through the tall, arched windows. Outside, the sounds of the castle, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant shouts of men at arms training in the yard seemed muted, distant, as if a heavy tapestry had been draped over the world, muffling all but the whispers that snaked through the court. Emmeline's fingers, usually so deft and sure, faltered. The thread, of vibrant crimson meant to depict the blood of a stag, snagged on the rough linen. She pricked her finger, a tiny bead of her own blood blossoming on the fabric. A fitting omen, she thought grimly. Blood was the currency of this court, traded as freely as gold, and often with less remorse. She had been summoned by Queen Isolde, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her ruthlessness. Isolde had been queen for 15 years, her reign marked by both prosperity and a chilling undercurrent of fear. She held her court in an iron grip, her network of spies and informants reaching into every corner of the kingdom, even, Emmeline suspected, into her own household. Emmeline, at 42, was no stranger to the court's treacherous currents. Widowed young, she had learned to navigate the swirling eddies of ambition and intrigue with a carefully cultivated mask of serene composure. Her late husband, Lord Alaric of Dunmore, had been a powerful man, loyal to the crown, but his death had left her vulnerable. She had no children, no strong male protector, only her wits and the dwindling influence of the Dunmore name to shield her. Emmeline, the Queen's voice, smooth as velvet yet edged with steel, cut through the silence. Emmeline rose, curtsying deeply, her silk gown whispering against the polished stone floor. "Your Majesty." Queen Isolde, seated on a throne-like chair draped with cloth of gold, regarded her with eyes the color of a winter sky, beautiful, but utterly devoid of warmth. "You are troubled, my lady. I see it in your face." Emmeline kept her expression carefully neutral. "Only by the concerns of my estate, Your Majesty. The harvest has been challenging." It was a lie, of course. The harvest was the least of her worries. "Challenging?" Isolde repeated, a delicate eyebrow arched. "Or, perhaps complicated." Emmeline's heart hammered against her ribs. The Queen knew. She always knew. The question was, how much? "There are rumors," Emmeline said, choosing her words with the care of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Rumors of discontent among the northern lords." Isolde leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "And you, Lady Dunmore, are privy to these rumors?" Emmeline had been slipping carefully worded messages, veiled in seemingly innocuous correspondence, to Lord Beaumont, a powerful northern lord whose loyalty to the crown was questionable. It was a dangerous game, one she had played for years, walking a tightrope between survival and treason. She believed, perhaps foolishly, that she was playing both sides against the middle, ensuring the safety of Dunmore, regardless of who ultimately held power. But Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's silent enforcer, the man they called the Shadow, had seen her. He had been standing in the shadows of the corridor, his dark eyes missing nothing, as she'd slipped a note into the hands of Beaumont's page. His presence was like a cold draft, a constant reminder of the king's unwavering scrutiny. "I hear whispers, Your Majesty," Emmeline replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "As we all do." "Whispers can be dangerous, Emmeline," Isolde said softly. "They can carry poison, incite rebellion, topple kingdoms." She paused, her fingers toying with a heavy gold ring on her finger, a ring bearing the royal crest. "And you, my dear, are so very close to those whispers." The Queen's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. Emmeline knew that her life, her estate, everything she held dear, rested on the edge of a blade. One wrong word, one misstep, and she would fall. Isolde gestured to a small table laden with sweetmeats and wine.
Come, sit.
Let us talk of more pleasant things. Emmeline obeyed, her mind racing. The Queen's invitation was not a gesture of friendship, it was a test. A carefully laid trap, baited with honeyed words and the illusion of trust. As she sipped the spiced wine, the taste of it bitter on her tongue, Emmeline watched the Queen, trying to decipher the thoughts behind that beautiful, impassive mask. She knew that she was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to her destruction. But she also knew that she had no choice. In the Queen's web, survival demanded a delicate balance of truth and deception, loyalty and betrayal. The Queen smiled, a slow, chilling curve of her lips. Tell me, Emmeline, she purred, what do you believe is the most important quality in a servant of the crown? Emmeline met her gaze, her own unwavering. The answer, she knew, was not loyalty. It was not honesty. It was something far more subtle, far more dangerous. It was the ability to anticipate, to adapt, to survive. Discretion, your majesty, Emmeline said, her voice calm and clear. And the wisdom to know when to speak, and when to remain silent. The Queen's smile widened, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps approval, in her cold eyes. The game, Emmeline knew, had only just begun. And as the shadows lengthened in the Queen's solar, she felt a growing unease, a premonition of the storms to come, and the chilling realization that Sir Roderick Locksley's gaze was only the beginning of her trials. The silence that followed the Queen's amusement was like a heavy stone, pressing down upon her. Chapter 2. A Night's Shadow. The corridor outside the Queen's solar was dim, lit only by flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Emmeline walked with a measured pace, her head held high, but her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The Queen's veiled threats echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the precariousness of her position. She had almost reached the grand staircase, leading down to the main hall, when a figure emerged from the shadows. Sir Roderick Locksley. He moved with a silent grace that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. He was a man of few words, his reputation preceding him like a chilling wind. The King's enforcer, they called him. The Shadow. A man who dealt in secrets and silence, whose loyalty to the crown was absolute and unquestioning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a physique honed by years of warfare. His face was lean and hard, his features sculpted as if from granite, and his eyes, a dark, piercing gray, seemed to see through to the very marrow of her bones. He wore no ornamentation, only the plain, dark tunic and leather jerkin of a warrior, a heavy sword strapped to his side. The only mark of distinction was the silver wolf's head brooch that fastened his cloak, the emblem of his ancient and formidable house. Lady Dunmore, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the corridor. It was not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. A warning. Emmeline stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She curtsied, a shallow, respectful dip of her head. Sir Roderick. He did not return the courtesy. He simply stood there, blocking her path, his presence an almost palpable force. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the torches and the distant sounds of the castle. "You think you are clever, my lady," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But tell me, do you truly understand the game you are playing?" His words, spoken so softly, were more menacing than any shout. They were a confirmation of her fears, a stark reminder that he had seen her, that he knew. Emmeline met his gaze, refusing to be cowed. "I understand the importance of survival, Sir Roderick," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I do what I must to protect my lands, my people." Survival? He raised a dark eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps contempt, in his eyes. "Is that what you call it? Trading secrets with a queen's enemies?" Her blood ran cold. He knew more than she had thought. "I have traded no secrets," she said. clinging to the lie with a desperate grip. I have only listened. Listening can be as dangerous as speaking, my lady, he said. Especially when you listen to the wrong people. He took a step closer, and Emmeline had to force herself not to flinch. The scent of him, leather, steel, and something wilder, something untamed, filled her senses. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines etched around his eyes, the scars of battles fought and won, the ghosts of a past he kept carefully hidden. Lord Beaumont is a powerful man, she said, trying to keep her voice even. It is wise to understand his concerns. Beaumont is a traitor, Roderick said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. And those who consort with traitors, he let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. But the threat was clear. Emmeline felt a surge of anger, a defiance that momentarily overcame her fear. I am no traitor, Sir Roderick, she said, her voice rising slightly. I am loyal to the crown. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Loyalty is a fragile thing, Lady Dunmore, he said finally. Easily broken, easily betrayed. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, like trust. The word hung between them, a sharp, pointed weapon. Emmeline knew that he was not only referring to her dealings with Beaumont, but to something deeper, something more personal. He was questioning her integrity, her honor. I have done nothing to betray the king's trust, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Haven't you? He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Or have you simply become adept at hiding your betrayals? She wanted to deny it, to scream at him, to defend herself against his accusations. But she knew that it would be futile. He had already made up his mind. He saw her as a threat, a pawn in a dangerous game, a woman to be watched, perhaps even eliminated. I understand your concerns, Sir Roderick, she said, choosing her words carefully. But I assure you, my intentions are honorable. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Honor, he repeated, the word sounding like a curse on his lips. A word often used to mask the most dishonorable deeds. The silence returned, heavier than before. Emmeline felt trapped, caught in the crosshairs of his suspicion, his unwavering gaze. She knew that she had to escape, to put some distance between herself and this man who saw too much, who knew too much. If you will excuse me, Sir Roderick, she said, her voice cool and formal. I have matters to attend to. He did not move. He simply stood there, watching her, his presence a dark, imposing shadow in the flickering torchlight. Emmeline took a deep breath, steeling herself. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. I am not afraid of you, Sir Roderick, she said, the words spoken softly, but with a conviction that surprised even herself. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even respect, crossed his face. It was gone so quickly that she might have imagined it. He stepped aside, finally, allowing her to pass. Perhaps you should be, Lady Dunmore, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Perhaps you should be. Emmeline walked past him, her head held high, her back straight. But as she descended the grand staircase, she could still feel his eyes on her, burning into her skin, a constant reminder of the danger she was in and the formidable enemy she had made. The echo of his last words followed her down the stairs, a chilling whisper in the grand hall's growing quiet. Chapter 3. The Price of Silence. The great hall of Dunmore Castle was a stark contrast to the opulence of the royal court. While it possessed its own ancient grandeur, with high, vaulted ceilings and walls adorned with faded tapestries depicting the history of the Dunmore lineage, it was a place of practicality, of sturdy stone and worn wood, reflecting the resilience of its mistress. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke from the massive hearth at one end, mingled with the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. Emmeline sat at the high table, presiding over the evening meal. Around her were gathered the members of her household, her steward, Master Elric, a thin, nervous man with a perpetually worried expression, her elderly chaplain, Father Michael, his face lined with the wisdom and weariness of years, and a handful of knights and ladies in waiting, their faces a mixture of loyalty and apprehension. The encounter with Sir Roderick Locksley had shaken her more than she cared to admit. His words, his accusations, had burrowed deep beneath her skin, stirring up old anxieties, old fears. She had spent years building a carefully constructed facade of composure, of control, but he had seen through it, had glimpsed the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden. She picked at her food, her appetite gone. The roasted boar, usually a delicacy, tasted like ashes in her mouth. The wine, a rich, dark vintage from her own vineyards, did little to soothe her frayed nerves. Master Elric cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "My lady," he began, "the reports from the north, they are not good. Lord Beaumont has been gathering his forces. There is talk of rebellion." Emmeline nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the hearth. She had known this was coming. Her messages to Beaumont, while carefully worded, had been intended to encourage his defiance, to create a distraction, a threat that would draw the king's attention away from other matters. It was a dangerous game, but one she had believed necessary. "We must prepare," she said, her voice calm and steady, despite the turmoil within. "Strengthen the defenses, gather supplies. We must be ready for anything." Father Michael, who had been silent until now, spoke, his voice soft but firm. "My lady," he said, "is this wise? To align yourself with those who would challenge the king?" Emmeline looked at him, her eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond the events of the day. "I am not aligning myself with anyone, father," she said. "I am simply preparing for the inevitable." She knew that her actions could be construed as treasonous. But she also knew that in this world, survival often demanded a willingness to walk a dangerous path, to make difficult choices. She had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, when her husband had been killed, leaving her alone and vulnerable. The memory of Alaric's death still haunted her. He had been a strong, honorable man, loyal to the king, but his loyalty had not saved him. He had been caught in the crossfire of a power struggle between rival factions, a victim of the court's endless intrigues. Emmeline had vowed then that she would never be so vulnerable again. She would learn to play the game, to manipulate, to deceive if necessary, to protect herself and her people. "The king trusts you, my lady," Father Michael said, his voice filled with concern. "He values your counsel." Emmeline gave a bitter smile. "The king trusts no one, father," she said. "He only trusts fear." And she knew that fear was a powerful weapon, one that could be used against her as easily as it could be used by her. Sir Roderick Locksley was a living embodiment of that fear, a constant reminder of the king's power, his reach. She pushed her plate away, the food untouched. "We must be careful," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Every word, every action must be weighed. We are surrounded by spies, by enemies." The members of her household exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the truth of her words. The court was a breeding ground for suspicion, for betrayal. And even here, within the walls of Dunmore Castle, they were not safe. Emmeline rose from the table, her movements stiff and deliberate. "I will retire for the night," she said. "Master Elric, ensure that the guards are doubled. Father Michael, I would speak with you in the chapel." She left the hall, the silence following her like a shroud. As she walked through the dimly lit corridors, she could feel the weight of her responsibilities, the burden of her secrets. She had made a choice, a dangerous choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. She reached the chapel, a small, intimate space lit only by the flickering glow of candles. The air was cool and still, the scent of incense lingering in the air. Father Michael was waiting for her, his face etched with concern. "My lady," he said, "you are troubled." Emmeline sank onto a wooden bench, her body weary, her spirit drained. "I am afraid, father," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what I have done, afraid of what is to come." He sat beside her, his presence a comforting anchor in the swirling darkness of her fears.
"Tell me," he said gently.
And so she did. She told him everything. Her dealings with Beaumont, her encounter with Locksley, her fears for the future. She spoke of her late husband, of her loneliness, of the burden of leadership she carried. As she spoke, she felt a sense of release, a lifting of the weight that had been pressing down on her. It was a relief to finally share her burdens, to speak the truth, even if only to this one trusted confidant. Father Michael listened patiently, his silence more comforting than any words could have been. When she had finished, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "My lady," he said, "you have walked a difficult path. You have made mistakes, as we all do. But your heart is true. You seek only to protect your people, to do what is right. But what if I am wrong, Father?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "What if my actions lead to destruction?" "We cannot know the future, my lady," he said. "We can only act according to our conscience, according to what we believe is right. And we must trust in God's grace, in His mercy." Emmeline closed her eyes, drawing strength from his words, from his faith. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, with uncertainty. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had her people, her faith, and, perhaps, a glimmer of hope that she could navigate the treacherous waters of the court and emerge, if not unscathed, then at least unbroken. The silence in the chapel was a balm. Chapter 4. Beneath the Gilded Cage. The days following Emmeline's encounter with Sir Roderick Locksley were filled with a tense, unsettling quiet. She returned to court, attending to her duties as a lady of the Queen's inner circle, but the shadow of suspicion hung over her like a shroud. She felt the weight of Locksley's gaze on her constantly, a silent, ever-present reminder of the danger she was in. Queen Isolde, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the shift in Emmeline's demeanor. She treated her with a cool courtesy, her words veiled with subtle barbs, her smiles lacking their usual, brittle charm. Emmeline knew that she was being tested, watched, her every move scrutinized. She found herself increasingly isolated, the other ladies of the court wary of her, unsure of her standing. The whispers followed her, murmuring doubts and suspicions, fueled by the Queen's subtle disapproval and Locksley's unwavering scrutiny. One afternoon, she found herself alone in the Queen's gardens, seeking a brief respite from the stifling atmosphere of the court. The gardens were a haven of tranquility, a riot of color and fragrance, with roses climbing over ancient stone walls, their petals a vibrant tapestry of red, pink, and white. The air was filled with the hum of bees, the gentle murmur of a nearby fountain. She sat on a stone bench, beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, and closed her eyes, trying to find some solace in the beauty that surrounded her. But even here, she could not escape the feeling of being trapped, of being watched. "Lady Dunmore." She opened her eyes, startled. Sir Roderick Locksley stood before her, his tall figure casting a long shadow over the sun-drenched path. He was dressed, as always, in his plain, dark attire, the silver wolf's head brooch gleaming on his cloak. "Sir Roderick," she said, her voice cool and formal. "What brings you to this tranquil corner of the court?" He did not answer immediately. He simply stood there, studying her, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the chirping of birds and the gentle murmur of the fountain. "I wish to speak with you," he said finally, his voice low and measured. Emmeline felt a flicker of apprehension. She had hoped to avoid him, to keep her distance, but it seemed that was not to be. "About what, Sir Roderick?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He moved closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of him leather, steel, and that wild, untamed essence stirred something within her, a mixture of fear and something else, something she could not quite name. "About your loyalty," he said, his gaze unwavering. Emmeline felt a surge of anger, a defiance that momentarily overcame her fear. "My loyalty has been questioned enough, Sir Roderick," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I have nothing more to say on the matter." He raised a dark eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes.
"Perhaps not," he said. "But I have much to say to you." He sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle tension that emanated from him, the intimacy of the gesture,
The unexpected closeness unnerved her. "I've been watching you, Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice soft, almost intimate. "Watching your movements, your interactions, your silences." Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. His words were a confirmation of her fears, a stark reminder that she was under constant surveillance. "And what have you concluded, Sir Roderick?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I have concluded," he said, his gaze holding hers, "that you are a woman of secrets. A woman who hides behind a mask of composure, a woman who plays a dangerous game." She wanted to deny it, to protest, to defend herself. But she knew that it would be futile. He had seen through her defenses, had glimpsed the truth that she kept so carefully hidden. "And what will you do with this conclusion, Sir Roderick?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. "That depends, Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice a low murmur.
"On you."
His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmeline felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. She knew that he was offering her a choice, a chance to what? To betray her allies? To confess her sins? To save herself? "I do not understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was calloused, rough from years of wielding a sword, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "I believe you do, Lady Dunmore," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I believe you understand far more than you let on." He held her gaze, his eyes locking with hers, and for a moment, Emmeline felt as if she were drowning in their depths. She saw something there, something beyond the cold, hard exterior of the king's enforcer. She saw a flicker of vulnerability, of loneliness, perhaps even a hint of something that resembled desire. The silence stretched, heavy and potent. He had seen parts of her that even she barely admitted. He saw the cage she felt trapped within. That, within itself, was dangerous. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Fallen. The chapel at the royal palace was a sanctuary of silence and shadows, a stark contrast to the opulent grandeur of the court. Emmeline often sought refuge here, finding solace in the quiet stillness, in the flickering candlelight, in the faint scent of incense that lingered in the air. She knelt before the altar, her head bowed, her hands clasped in prayer. But her mind was far from peaceful. The encounter with Sir Roderick Locksley in the gardens had left her shaken, unsettled. His words, his touch, had stirred something within her, a confusing mixture of fear and something else, something she dared not name. She had tried to push him from her thoughts, to focus on her duties, on the dangerous game she was playing. But his image kept returning, his dark eyes haunting her dreams, his voice echoing in her mind. She was startled by a soft cough. She looked up, her heart pounding. Sir Roderick Locksley stood in the shadows near the entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. "Sir Roderick," she said, her voice a breathless whisper. What are you doing here?" He did not answer immediately. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the candles and the distant murmur of voices from the court. "I came to pray," he said finally, his voice low and resonant. Emmeline felt a flicker of surprise. She had never thought of him as a man of faith, of piety. He seemed too hard, too cynical, too immersed in the dark and brutal realities of the world. "For what do you pray, Sir Roderick?" she asked, her voice curious, despite herself. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. He knelt beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel his presence, the subtle warmth that emanated from him. "For forgiveness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emmeline was taken aback. Forgiveness? For what? She had always seen him as the enforcer, the judge, the one who meted out punishment, not the one who sought absolution. "For what sins do you seek forgiveness, Sir Roderick?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. In the dim light, she could see the lines of pain etched around his eyes, the shadows of a past that haunted him. "For the sins of my past," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "For the blood I have spilled, for the lives I have taken, for the oaths I have broken." Emmeline felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to carry the burden of guilt, of regret. She, too, had made choices, had done things that she was not proud of. "We all have our sins, Sir Roderick," she said softly. "We all carry our burdens." "Mine are heavier than most, Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice filled with a deep, abiding weariness. He told her then, in a low, halting voice, of his past, of his youth, spent in the shadow of his father, a legendary warrior, a man of unwavering loyalty to the crown, of his own early years, filled with the brutal training of a knight, the constant pressure to live up to his father's legacy. He spoke of his first battle, the fear, the exhilaration, the horror of taking a life, of the countless battles that followed, the endless cycle of violence, of death, of the friends he had lost, the comrades he had seen fall. He told her of a woman he had loved, a woman he had been forced to betray, a woman who had died because of his actions. He did not go into detail, but the pain in his voice, the anguish in his eyes, spoke volumes. Emmeline listened in silence, her heart aching for him. She saw now, beneath the hard, cold exterior, a man who was deeply wounded, a man who carried the scars of his past like a heavy chain. "I have tried to atone," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I have served the king faithfully, unquestioningly. I have tried to be honorable, to do what is right. But it is not enough," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "The ghosts, they still haunt me." Emmeline reached out and touched his hand, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his hand trembled beneath hers. "We can never truly escape our past, Sir Roderick," she said softly. "But we can learn from it. We can strive to be better, to do better." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you believe that, Lady Dunmore?" he asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "Do you believe that redemption is possible?" "I do," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I must." She knew that she was speaking not only to him, but to herself. She, too, sought redemption, a way to atone for her own sins, for her own betrayals. He held her gaze, his eyes locking with hers, and for a moment, the silence between them was filled with a shared understanding, a shared pain, a shared hope. The echoes of their pasts mingled in the stillness of the chapel. The weight of his confession seemed to create a new, fragile bond between them. Chapter 6. The Falcon's Flight. The royal hunt was a grand affair, a display of power and wealth, a chance for the nobles to demonstrate their prowess and their loyalty to the king. Emmeline, dressed in a riding habit of deep green velvet, her hair braided and adorned with a single, jeweled feather, watched the proceedings with a mixture of boredom and apprehension. She had never been fond of hunting. She found the spectacle of killing for sport distasteful, the needless bloodshed a jarring contrast to the beauty of the surrounding forest. But she knew that her presence was required, that her absence would be noted, interpreted as a sign of disloyalty. She rode a spirited gray mare, a gift from the king years ago, a reminder of her obligations. The mare was restless, sensing her mistress's unease, tossing her head and pawing the ground. The forest was alive with the sounds of the hunt, the baying of hounds, the thundering of hooves, the shouts of the huntsmen. The air was crisp and cool, scented with the rich, earthy aroma of damp leaves and pine needles. Emmeline kept to the edge of the hunting party, trying to remain inconspicuous, but she knew that she was being watched. Sir Roderick Locksley, mounted on a powerful black stallion, rode a short distance away, his dark eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his presence a silent, ever-present reminder of her precarious position. She had not spoken to him since their encounter in the chapel. His confession, his vulnerability, had shaken her, had changed the way she saw him. She had glimpsed a man beneath the mask, a man haunted by his past, a man who, like her, sought redemption. But she also knew that he was still the king's enforcer, still a threat, still a man who could destroy her with a single word. The hunt progressed, the quarry a magnificent stag proving elusive. The king, a large, imposing man with a booming laugh and a ruthless streak, grew increasingly impatient. He urged his huntsmen on, his voice echoing through the forest. Suddenly, there was a shout, a cry of alarm. One of the huntsmen had been thrown from his horse, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The hounds, excited by the scent of blood, were closing in on him, their baying growing louder, more frenzied. Emmeline reacted instinctively. She spurred her mare forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to reach the huntsman before the hounds did. She rode with a reckless abandon, ignoring the shouts of the other riders, the warnings to stay back. She was a skilled horsewoman, honed by years of riding across the rugged terrain of her own estate. She reached the huntsman just as the lead hound was about to lunge. She drew her riding crop, a short, weighted whip, and lashed out, striking the hound across the snout. The hound yelped, startled, and backed away. She dismounted, her movements swift and efficient. She knelt beside the injured huntsman, assessing his injuries. His leg was broken, badly. She looked up, her eyes searching for help. Sir Roderick Locksley was the first to reach her. He dismounted, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. "Is he badly hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "His leg is broken," Emmeline replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We need to get him back to the castle." Locksley nodded. He barked orders, his voice carrying authority, and within moments, several other riders had arrived. They carefully lifted the injured huntsman onto a makeshift stretcher, fashioned from cloaks and branches. Locksley turned to Emmeline, his gaze intense. "You were reckless, Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice a mixture of disapproval and something else, something that sounded like admiration. "He would have been killed," Emmeline said, her voice defiant. "I did what I had to do." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "You have courage, my lady," he said finally. "More than most." He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers brushing against her sleeve. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a shiver through her. "Come," he said, his voice softening. "Let us return to the castle." They rode back together, side by side, the silence between them filled with a strange, unspoken tension. Emmeline was acutely aware of his presence, of his strength, of his protectiveness. As she rode, her earlier fears of him felt strangely distant, replaced by a peculiar warmth from this newfound understanding. His actions had mirrored the falcon's flight, swift and decisive, a show of power in the face of danger. Chapter 7. A Dance of Deception. The Queen's Ball was a glittering spectacle, a dazzling display of wealth and power. The great hall of the royal palace was transformed, ablaze with the light of hundreds of candles, the air filled with the music of lutes and viols, the murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk and velvet. Emmeline, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk, embroidered with silver thread, moved through the throng with a practiced grace, her head held high, her smile carefully composed. But beneath the surface, she was a whirlwind of anxiety. The events of a hunt had shifted the dynamics of the court. Her act of bravery, saving the huntsman, had earned her the king's grudging respect and, more importantly, had subtly altered Sir Roderick Locksley's perception of her. He had treated her with a cautious courtesy since then, his gaze less suspicious, his demeanor less threatening. But she knew that this reprieve was temporary, that the underlying tensions remained. The Queen's suspicions had not abated, and the whispers still followed her, murmuring doubts and accusations. She danced with several of the courtiers, exchanging pleasantries, parrying their veiled inquiries, maintaining the facade of serene composure. But her mind was elsewhere, constantly scanning the room, searching for him. She saw him finally, standing near one of the tall, arched windows, his dark figure silhouetted against the night sky. Sir Roderick Locksley. He was not dancing, not engaging in the frivolous chatter of the court. He simply stood there, watching, his gaze intense and unreadable. He was dressed in a doublet of black velvet, the silver wolf's head brooch gleaming on his chest. He looked magnificent, a dark, brooding presence amidst the glittering revelry. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and Emmeline felt a jolt of electricity, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. He inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement, and then turned away. She continued to dance, but her heart was no longer in it. She felt a strange pull, a desire to speak to him, to understand the unspoken currents that flowed between them. As the evening wore on, she found herself drawn to the periphery of the hall, closer to where he stood. She accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant, her hand trembling slightly. He turned, finally, and their eyes met again. This time, he did not look away. He took a step towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice low and resonant, a stark contrast to the music and chatter that surrounded them. "Sir Roderick," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the swirling sounds of the ball. "You dance well, my lady," he said, his gaze sweeping over her. It was a compliment, a simple observation, but his voice, his eyes, gave it a deeper meaning. "It is a skill required of all ladies of the court," she replied, her voice cool and formal. "But some dance with more grace than others," he said, his gaze holding hers. He was referring not only to her dancing, but to her ability to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, to play the game of deception, to survive. "And some dance with danger," she said, her voice a low murmur, her eyes meeting his. He smiled then, a slow, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Indeed," he said, "and danger can be intoxicating." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was warm, strong, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Will you dance with me, Lady Dunmore?" he asked, his voice a low, husky murmur. It was a request, but it was also a challenge. A test. A step into the unknown. Emmeline hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. To dance with him, in full view of the court, would be to acknowledge their connection, to invite speculation, to risk the Queen's wrath. But she also knew that she could not refuse. To do so would be to show weakness, to betray her fear. She placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling slightly. "I would be honored, Sir Roderick," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He led her onto the dance floor, his hand firm on her waist, his movements graceful and assured. They danced in silence, their bodies close, their eyes locked. The music swirled around them, but Emmeline was oblivious to everything but him. She was acutely aware of his presence, of his strength, of the subtle tension that emanated from him. She could feel the eyes of the court upon them, the whispers, the speculation. But in that moment, she did not care. She was lost in the dance, lost in the moment, lost in the dangerous, intoxicating pull of this man who was both her enemy and something more. The dance was a subtle battle and a fragile truce, wrapped into one. Chapter 8. The Lion's Roar. The summons came abruptly, a terse message delivered by a royal page, his face pale and anxious. Emmeline was to present herself before the king immediately. No explanation was given, no reason offered, only the chilling command. Her heart sank. She had known that the reprieve was temporary, that the dance of deception could not last forever. The king's patience, like a coiled viper, was about to strike. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple gown of dark gray wool, her only adornment a silver chain bearing the crest of Dunmore. She needed no jewels, no finery, to face this confrontation. She would rely on her wits, her courage, and the carefully constructed mask of composure she had worn for so long. As she walked through the corridors of the palace, she felt the weight of the eyes upon her, the whispers following her like shadows. The courtiers, sensing the shift in the wind, were quick to distance themselves to avoid being caught in the storm that was about to break. She reached the king's audience chamber, a large, imposing room dominated by a massive throne of carved oak, draped with cloth of gold. The air was thick with tension, the silence heavy and oppressive. King Alaric sat on the throne, his face a mask of cold fury. He was a large man, his physique still powerful despite his advancing years, his eyes sharp and ruthless, his mouth set in a grim line. Queen Isolde stood beside him, her beautiful face serene, her eyes devoid of emotion. Sir Roderick Locksley stood near the throne, his tall figure erect, his expression unreadable. He did not meet her gaze. Emmeline curtsied deeply, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice calm and steady, despite the tremor in her hands. The king did not acknowledge her courtesy. He simply stared at her, his gaze like a physical blow. "Lady Dunmore," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You stand accused of treason." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine, but she did not flinch. She had expected this, had prepared for it, but the reality of the accusation, spoken aloud, was still a shock. "I am loyal to the crown, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. The king gave a short, brutal laugh. "Loyalty?" he repeated, the words sounding like a curse. "You speak of loyalty, while consorting with my enemies." He gestured to a table, where a small, sealed parchment lay. It was one of her messages to Lord Beaumont, intercepted, no doubt, by one of the Queen's spies. Emmeline's heart sank. She had been careful, so careful, but it had not been enough. The Queen's web was too intricate, too far-reaching. "This missive," the king said, his voice dripping with contempt, "was found in the possession of a servant of Lord Beaumont. It speaks of discontent, of rebellion, of treachery." He rose from the throne, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. He approached her, his presence filling the room, his anger a palpable force. "Do you deny writing this, Lady Dunmore?" he asked, his voice a low, menacing growl. Emmeline knew that denial was futile. The evidence was there in her own hand. To lie would only make matters worse. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I do not deny writing it, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and steady. A murmur of shock ran through the room. The courtiers, who had been watching in silent anticipation, were stunned by her admission. The king stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You admit your guilt?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "I admit writing the message," Emmeline said, her gaze meeting his. "But I do not admit to treason." She explained then, her voice calm and reasoned, her strategy. She had written the message, she said, to gauge Beaumont's intentions, to understand the extent of his disloyalty, to protect the realm. It was a lie, of course, a carefully constructed fabrication. But it was a plausible lie, one that played on the king's own paranoia, his own distrust of his nobles. "I have always been loyal to the crown, Your Majesty," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "My actions, however unconventional, were intended to serve your interests." The king studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. He was trying to see through her, to discern the truth from the lies. Emmeline held his gaze, her own unwavering. She knew that her life hung in the balance, that one wrong word, one flicker of doubt, could seal her fate. Queen Isolde, who had been silent until now, spoke, her voice smooth as silk. "A clever explanation, Lady Dunmore," she said. "But is it the truth?" Emmeline turned to her, her eyes meeting the Queen's cold, calculating gaze. "It is, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Finally, the king spoke, his voice low and grudging. "I will consider your explanation, Lady Dunmore," he said. "But know this, I am not easily fooled. And if I find that you have deceived me," he let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. But the threat was clear. Emmeline curtsied again, her movements slow and deliberate. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said. She was dismissed, allowed to leave the audience chamber, but she knew that she was not free. She was still under suspicion, still a prisoner of the court, her fate uncertain. As she left, she glanced at Sir Roderick, who was looking at her intently. The question in his eyes was obvious, and heavier than any chains. Chapter 9. Whispers in the Cloisters. The monastery of St. Jude was a haven of peace and tranquility, nestled in a secluded valley far from the intrigues of the court. Emmeline had sought refuge here, seeking solace and guidance, a respite from the relentless pressure of her precarious position. She had been granted permission to visit, a rare concession from the king, perhaps a sign that he was not entirely convinced of her guilt. Or perhaps, she thought grimly, it was simply a way to keep her isolated, to remove her from the court while he decided her fate. The monastery was a world apart, a place of simple stone buildings, surrounded by gardens and orchards, the air filled with the scent of herbs and the gentle murmur of prayers. The monks, clad in their simple brown habits, moved with a quiet serenity, their lives dedicated to God and to the pursuit of knowledge. Emmeline, dressed in a plain woolen gown, her hair unadorned, felt a sense of peace wash over her as she entered the monastery gates. It was a relief to be away from the stifling atmosphere of the court, from the constant scrutiny, the endless whispers. She was greeted by the abbot, a kindly, elderly man with a gentle smile and wise, knowing eyes. He welcomed her warmly, offering her hospitality and a place to rest and reflect. She spent her days in quiet contemplation, wandering through the gardens, attending the services in the chapel, finding solace in the ancient rituals, in the timeless rhythm of monastic life. She spoke with the abbot, seeking his counsel, his guidance. She told him of her struggles, her fears, her doubts. She did not reveal the full extent of her dealings with Beaumont, but she spoke of the pressures of the court, the dangers of ambition, the burden of leadership. The abbot listened patiently, his silence more comforting than any words could have been. He offered her no easy answers, no simple solutions. But he reminded her of the importance of faith, of courage, of staying true to her conscience, even in the face of adversity. One evening, as she was walking through the cloisters, she heard a familiar voice. She turned, startled. Sir Roderick Locksley stood in the shadows, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading light filtering through the arched windows. "Sir Roderick," she said, her voice a breathless whisper. What are you doing here?" He did not answer immediately. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant chanting of the monks. "I came to see you," he said finally, his voice low and resonant. Emmeline felt a flicker of apprehension. She had hoped to avoid him, to keep her distance, but it seemed that was not to be.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He moved closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of him leather, steel, and that wild, untamed essence stirred something within her, a confusing mixture of fear and something else. "The king has made his decision," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Emmeline's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but the finality of his words, the stark reality of her fate, was still a blow. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has found you not guilty," Locksley said. Emmeline felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense that her knees almost buckled. She had been spared, at least for now. "But," Locksley continued, his voice hardening, "he has not forgotten. He still suspects you. He still watches you." Emmeline nodded, her gaze meeting his. She knew that this was not a victory, only a temporary reprieve. She was still a prisoner, still caught in the Queen's web. "Why are you here, Sir Roderick?" she asked again, her voice stronger now, her fear replaced by a growing curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "I wanted to warn you," he said finally, his voice low and urgent. "The Queen, she is not convinced of your innocence. She believes you are still a threat." Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. She had known that the queen was her true enemy, that the king's suspicions were fueled by her machinations. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "You must be careful," Locksley said. "You must be discreet. You must give her no reason to doubt you." He reached out and touched her arm, his fingers brushing against her sleeve. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a shiver through her. "I will try," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He held her gaze, his eyes locking with hers, and for a moment, the silence between them was filled with a strange, unspoken understanding. He was not just warning her. He was something more. The cloister held secrets that she still didn't know. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell, and Locksley moved away, once again a man of shadow and duty. Chapter 10. The Torn Tapestry. Emmeline returned to Dunmore Castle, not with the triumphant fanfare of a vindicated noble, but with the quiet, somber air of a prisoner on parole. The king's verdict had cleared her name, but the stain of suspicion lingered, a shadow that clung to her reputation, a whisper that followed her through the familiar halls of her ancestral home. The welcome from her household was warm, relieved, but tinged with a cautious apprehension. They knew, as she did, that the danger had not passed, that the queen's web still stretched its silken threads around them. Master Elric, ever the pragmatist, brought news of the estate, of the ongoing tensions with the northern lords, of the subtle shifts in alliances that rippled through the kingdom. Father Michael offered prayers of thanksgiving for her safe return, but his eyes held a lingering concern, a quiet understanding of the trials that still lay ahead. Emmeline tried to resume her duties, to oversee the running of the estate, to provide leadership and reassurance to her people. But her heart was heavy, her spirit weary. The constant scrutiny, the endless suspicion, had taken its toll. She found herself increasingly drawn to the solitude of the castle's old library, a vast, dusty chamber filled with ancient tomes and forgotten scrolls. It was a place of quiet contemplation, a refuge from the anxieties and uncertainties of the present. One afternoon, as she was browsing through the shelves, she came across a large, rolled-up tapestry, tucked away in a forgotten corner. Curious, she unrolled it, her fingers tracing the faded threads. It was an old tapestry depicting the history of the Dunmore family, a vibrant, intricate scene of battles fought and won, of alliances forged and broken, of generations of men and women who had lived and died within these walls. But as she looked closer, she noticed something amiss. A section of the tapestry, near the center, had been deliberately cut, removed, leaving a gaping hole in the narrative. She examined the edges of the cut, her fingers tracing the frayed threads. It had been done carefully, precisely, with a sharp blade. But why? What had been depicted in that missing section? And who had removed it? She questioned Master Elric, Father Michael, the older members of her household, but none could offer any explanation. The tapestry, they said, had always been like that as far as they could remember. Emmeline was not satisfied. She sensed a hidden meaning, a secret concealed within that missing piece of fabric. It was a puzzle, a mystery, and she was determined to solve it. She spent hours poring over old records, searching for any mention of the tapestry, any clue that might shed light on its missing section. She found nothing. It was as if that part of the family history had been deliberately erased, wiped clean from the record. One evening, as she was sitting in the library, lost in thought, she heard a soft knock on the door. She looked up, startled. Sir Roderick Locksley stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. He was no longer to be referred as Sir, as the king had stripped him of such title as rumors of him aiding Lady Emmeline had circulated and reached the king. "Roderick," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else, something she could not quite name. He entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "I heard you had returned," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I have," she replied, her voice cool and formal. "But I am still under suspicion." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her. "The queen she does not give up easily," he said. He moved closer, his presence filling the room. The scent of him leather, steel, and that wild, untamed essence stirred something within her, a confusing mixture of fear and anticipation. "I found this," she said, gesturing to the tapestry, unrolled on the floor. A piece missing. He examined the tapestry, his eyes narrowing. "Deliberately removed," he said.
"But why?"
Emmeline told him of her search, of her frustration, of her growing conviction that the missing section held a key to something. He listened patiently, his silence more comforting than any words could have been. When she had finished, he reached out and touched the frayed edges of the cut, his fingers tracing the outline of the missing piece. "There are secrets here, Emmeline," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Secrets that someone wants to keep hidden." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "And I believe," he added, his voice barely a whisper, "that those secrets are connected to you." The statement hung in the air. The torn tapestry suddenly became more significant than an old piece of cloth. The whispers of the missing section whispered through the halls of Dunmore, like the wind itself. Chapter 11. The Weight of Oaths. Roderick's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Secrets. Connected to her. The torn tapestry, the missing piece of her family history, suddenly felt like a tangible representation of the hidden truths that swirled around her, truths that threatened to unravel her carefully constructed world. He had come to Dunmore unannounced, defying the king's unspoken disapproval, risking his own precarious position to warn her, to offer his assistance. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a testament to the complex, unspoken bond that had formed between them. He was no longer Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's enforcer. The title had been stripped from him, a consequence of the rumors that he had aided her, that he had shown her leniency. It was a mark of disgrace, a public humiliation, but he seemed to wear it with a quiet defiance, a stoic acceptance that only deepened her respect for him. "What secrets?" Emmeline asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you know?" He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He was weighing his words, measuring the risk, caught between his loyalty to the crown and his growing allegiance to her. "I know that your family has a history," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "A history that is not entirely honorable. A history that the Queen is interested in." Emmeline felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that the Dunmore lineage was not without its blemishes, that her ancestors had played their part in the turbulent history of the kingdom. But to hear it spoken aloud, by him, made it feel more real, more threatening. "What history?" She pressed, her voice urgent. "What does the Queen know?" He told her then, in a low, halting voice, of a long-forgotten rebellion, a conspiracy against the crown that had taken place generations ago. The Dunmores, he said, had been involved, had played a key role in the plot, but had managed to escape punishment, to conceal their involvement, to rewrite their history. "The Queen has found evidence," he said. "Evidence that links your family to the rebellion. Evidence that she intends to use against you." Emmeline felt a wave of despair wash over her. It was worse than she had feared. The Queen was not simply suspicious of her, she was actively seeking to destroy her, to use her family's past sins to bring her down.
"But why?"
she asked, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "Why now? What does she gain?" Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "Power," he said simply. "Control. The Queen sees you as a threat, a potential rival. She wants to eliminate you, to silence you, to consolidate her hold on the throne." He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt of electricity through her. "You are in danger, Emmeline," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You must be careful. You must trust no one." "Except you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes meeting his. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I have sworn an oath," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "An oath to serve the king, to uphold the law." But the unspoken words hung between them, the weight of his past, the burden of his conscience, the growing conflict between his duty and his feelings for her. "But oaths can be broken," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "And what would you have me do, Emmeline?" he asked, his voice a low, husky murmur. "Betray my king? Defy the queen? Risk everything for you?" It was a question, but it was also a challenge. A test. A plea. Emmeline did not answer immediately. She knew that she was asking him to make an impossible choice, to choose between his loyalty and his heart. She placed her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm, strong, his touch sending a shiver through her. "I am asking you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "to choose what is right." Roderick's gaze softened, and the weight of oaths seemed a palpable presence. The moment stretched into a long, meaningful silence. Chapter 12. Beyond the castle walls. The decision was made, unspoken but understood. Roderick, stripped of his title but not his resolve, would help Emmeline uncover the truth behind the torn tapestry, the secrets of her family history, the Queen's machinations. It was a dangerous alliance, a pact forged in the shadows, a defiance of the crown that could cost them both their lives. They left Dunmore Castle under the cover of darkness, riding north, towards the wild, untamed lands that bordered the kingdom. It was a journey fraught with peril, a flight from the Queen's reach, a desperate search for answers. They traveled light, dressed as simple travelers, avoiding the main roads, keeping to the hidden paths, the ancient tracks that crisscrossed the countryside. They slept under the stars, sharing meager meals, their conversations hushed, their movements cautious. Emmeline found herself relying on Roderick, on his strength, his knowledge of the land, his unwavering protection. He was a skilled tracker, a seasoned warrior, his senses honed by years of experience. He anticipated danger, navigated treacherous terrain, shielded her from harm. She, in turn, offered him her trust, her unwavering belief in his integrity, her willingness to share the burden of her secrets, the weight of her fears. It was a partnership born of necessity, but it was also something more, a growing bond of mutual respect, of shared vulnerability, of something deeper, something she dared not name. As they journeyed, Roderick told her more about the rebellion, about the key players, about the events that had led to the conspiracy, to the subsequent cover-up. He had pieced together the story from fragmented records, from whispered rumors, from his own intimate knowledge of the court's hidden history. He spoke of a secret society, a group of nobles who had plotted to overthrow the king, to install a new ruler, a puppet who would be more amenable to their interests. The Dunmores, he said, had been among the leaders of the society, had provided funding, had recruited allies, had played a central role in the conspiracy. But the rebellion had failed. The king's forces had crushed the uprising, had executed the ringleaders, had imposed a brutal reign of terror. The Dunmores, however, had managed to escape justice, to conceal their involvement, to rewrite their history. They destroyed the evidence, Roderick said. They silenced the witnesses. They bribed, they threatened, they erased the truth. But the Queen has found something, Emmeline said, her voice filled with a growing dread. Something that links my family to the rebellion. Roderick nodded. A document, he said. A letter, a confession, a list of names. Something that proves your family's guilt. And she intends to use it against me, Emmeline said, her voice barely a whisper. To destroy you, Roderick confirmed. To eliminate you as a threat. They reached their destination, a small, isolated village nestled in the foothills of the mountains. It was a place of rough stone houses, of hardy, independent people, a community that lived outside the reach of the court, beyond the control of the king. Roderick had a contact here, an old woman, a former servant of the Dunmore family, a woman who had known Emmeline's grandmother, a woman who, he believed, held the key to the missing piece of the tapestry, to the secrets of the past. They found her living in a small, humble cottage, on the edge of the village. She was ancient, her face a wrinkled map of time, her eyes still sharp and knowing. She greeted Roderick with a cautious respect, her gaze wary, her movements slow and deliberate. Emmeline introduced herself, her voice gentle, her manner respectful. She spoke of her family, of the tapestry, of the missing piece, of her search for the truth. The old woman listened in silence, her eyes studying Emmeline, searching her soul. When she had finished, the old woman nodded slowly. "I remember," she said, her voice raspy with age. "I remember the tapestry. I remember the secret." She led them into her cottage, a dimly lit space filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. She rummaged through an old wooden chest, her hands trembling with age. She pulled out a small, carefully wrapped bundle, tied with faded ribbon. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is what you seek." The bundle was a weighty silence, placed into Emmeline's care. The weight of years and hidden truths pressed in on her. Chapter 13. Scars of the Past. Emmeline carefully unwrapped the bundle, her fingers trembling with anticipation and a growing sense of dread. Inside, nestled within layers of faded linen, was a piece of embroidered fabric, a fragment of the torn tapestry, the missing piece of her family history. It depicted a scene of clandestine meeting, a group of figures gathered in a darkened room, their faces obscured by shadows, their identities hidden. But there were clues, subtle details, that revealed their allegiance. A crest, a sigil, a particular pattern of clothing. And in the center of the scene, standing tall and proud, was a figure that Emmeline recognized instantly. Her ancestor, Lord Alaric Dunmore, the great-grandfather she had known only through faded portraits and sanitized family lore. He was holding a document, a scroll sealed with a distinctive wax seal, the symbol of the secret society, the emblem of their treason. It was the proof, the damning evidence that the Queen had sought, the confirmation of her family's guilt, the weapon that could be used to destroy her. Emmeline felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal. The history she had known, the legacy she had inherited, was a lie, a carefully constructed facade that concealed a dark and dangerous truth. Roderick, standing beside her, watched her with a quiet intensity, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. He had known the truth, had suspected it all along, but seeing it confirmed, seeing the impact on Emmeline, was still a blow. "I don't understand," Emmeline said, her voice trembling. "Why would they do this? Why would they risk everything?" The old woman, who had been watching in silence, spoke, her voice raspy with age. "Power," she said simply. "Ambition. Greed. They believed they could control the kingdom, that they could shape the future to their liking. But they failed," Emmeline said, her voice filled with bitterness. "And they left us to pay the price. They made their choices," the old woman said. "And we live with the consequences." Emmeline looked at the fragment of tapestry, at the image of her ancestor, at the symbol of his treason. She felt a strange mixture of anger and pity. He had been a man of ambition, a man of power, but he had also been a man of flaws, a man who had made a terrible mistake. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze meeting Roderick's. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm, strong, his touch reassuring. "We destroy it," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We destroy the evidence. We erase the past. We protect your future." It was a dangerous proposition, a defiance of the Queen's will, a betrayal of the truth. But it was also the only way, the only chance to save herself, to protect her family, to break free from the shackles of the past. "But is it right?" Emmeline asked, her voice filled with doubt. "To conceal the truth? To perpetuate the lie?" Roderick looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low and urgent, "the truth is too dangerous. Sometimes, it is better to let the past remain buried." He was speaking not only of the tapestry, but of his own past, of his own secrets, of the burdens he carried, of the oaths he had broken. Emmeline nodded, her decision made. She would destroy the evidence, she would erase the past, she would forge a new future, a future free from the shadows of her ancestors' sins. They left the old woman's cottage, they thanked her, and then Roderick built fire. As the flames consumed the fabric, turning it to ashes, Emmeline felt a sense of release, a lifting of the weight that had been pressing down on her. It was a symbolic act, a cleansing, a severing of the ties that bound her to the past. The scars of the past, however, remained. Emily knew they always would. Chapter 14. A Glimmer of Hope. The journey back to Dunmore was filled with a quiet, reflective mood. The burning of the tapestry fragment, the symbolic destruction of the past, had left Emmeline with a mixture of relief and a lingering sense of unease. She had erased the evidence, had protected herself from the Queen's immediate threat, but the underlying truth remained, a hidden fault line beneath the surface of her life. Roderick, too, was subdued, his thoughts turned inward, grappling with the consequences of his actions, the weight of the oaths he had broken, the uncertain future that lay ahead. He had chosen to defy the Queen, to protect Emmeline, to align himself with her cause, and he knew that the price of that choice could be steep. They rode in silence for long stretches, their communication reduced to shared glances, subtle gestures, a silent understanding that transcended words. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the crucible of shared danger, of mutual trust, of a growing affection that neither of them dared to acknowledge openly. As they approached Dunmore, Emmeline felt a flicker of hope, a sense of returning strength. She had faced the darkness of her family's past, had confronted the threat of the Queen, had made a difficult choice, and she had survived. She was not unscathed, not unbroken, but she was stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever. She was also aware of the shift in her relationship with Roderick. He was no longer simply an ally, a protector, a fellow conspirator. He was something more, something she could not quite define, something that stirred a warmth within her, a longing that she had long suppressed. They reached Dunmore Castle under the cover of darkness, slipping through the gates unnoticed, their return as clandestine as their departure. The household was relieved to see them, their faces etched with concern, their questions unspoken. Emmeline reassured them, her voice calm and steady, her demeanor confident. She told them that the journey had been successful, that the threat had been neutralized, but she offered no details, no explanations. She knew that she could not trust everyone, that the Queen's spies were still among them, that the danger was still present. She retired to her chambers, exhausted but strangely exhilarated. She had faced her fears, had taken control of her destiny, had found a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She was not alone. She had Roderick. And that, she realized, made all the difference. She was preparing for bed, unlacing her gown, when there was a soft knock on the door. She knew, instinctively, who it was. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Roderick entered the room, his tall figure filling the space, his presence a comforting anchor in the swirling uncertainties of her life. He was dressed in his simple traveling clothes, his face etched with weariness, but his eyes held a warmth, a tenderness, that she had not seen before. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "I am," she replied, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. "Better than I have been in a long time." He moved closer, his presence filling her senses. The scent of him leather, wood smoke, and that wild, untamed essence stirred something deep within her, a longing that she could no longer deny. "We did what we had to do," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Yes," she agreed. "But what now?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "Now," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination, "we face the future together." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm, strong, his touch sending a shiver through her. He did not speak of love. It was too early, too dangerous. Emmeline looked into his eyes, seeing past the warrior and the former knight, and finding a gentle soul she'd missed before. There was a spark, a faint light, a new beginning, perhaps. Chapter 15. The Heart's Rebellion. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, unspoken tension, a sense of anticipation, a growing awareness of the unspoken feelings that simmered between Emmeline and Roderick. They were living under the same roof, sharing meals, working together to manage the estate, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the Queen, but their interactions were charged with a new intimacy, a subtle undercurrent of desire that neither of them dared to acknowledge openly. They were careful, cautious, aware of the eyes that watched them, of the whispers that followed them. They maintained a facade of formality, of professional courtesy, but beneath the surface, their hearts were in rebellion, yearning for a connection that was both forbidden and irresistible. Emmeline found herself increasingly drawn to Roderick, to his strength, his quiet confidence, his unwavering loyalty. She saw in him a man of integrity, a man of honor, a man who had sacrificed everything to protect her, to stand by her side. She admired his resilience, his courage, his ability to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. She also saw, beneath the hardened exterior of the warrior, a vulnerability, a tenderness, a longing for connection that mirrored her own. She sensed his loneliness, his isolation, the burden of his past, the weight of his broken oaths. She longed to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, to ease his pain, to share her own vulnerabilities, her own fears. But she held back, restrained by the constraints of their situation, by the dangers that surrounded them, by the unspoken rules that governed their world. Roderick, too, was struggling with his feelings for Emmeline. He had always been a man of discipline, of control, a man who kept his emotions in check, who lived by a strict code of conduct. But Emmeline had awakened something within him, something he had long suppressed, something he had believed was lost forever. He admired her courage, her resilience, her unwavering determination to protect her people, to fight for what she believed in. He saw in her a woman of strength, a woman of intelligence, a woman of passion, a woman who challenged him, who inspired him, who made him question everything he had ever believed. He longed to hold her, to protect her, to confess his feelings, to offer her his love, his devotion. But he held back, restrained by his sense of duty, by his fear of rejection, by the knowledge that their love was forbidden, dangerous, perhaps even impossible. One evening, as they were working together in the library, reviewing documents, planning their strategy, the tension between them reached a breaking point. They were sitting close together, their hands brushing accidentally, their eyes meeting across the table, their unspoken feelings hanging heavy in the air. Emmeline, unable to bear the silence any longer, spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Roderick," she said, her gaze searching his. What are we doing?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He knew what she was asking, what she was feeling. He felt it too. "We are surviving," he said, his voice low and husky. "We are fighting." "But is that all?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm, strong, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "No," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "That is not all." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her skin. "Emmeline," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. He did not finish the sentence.
He did not need to.
His eyes, his touch, his presence spoke volumes. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a gentle merging of two souls who had long denied their desires. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of the pent-up emotions, the unspoken longings that had been simmering between them for so long. It was a kiss of rebellion, a defiance of the world, a declaration of a love that could no longer be denied. The rebellion wasn't just against the crown anymore. It was of the heart, of souls, of two individuals daring to reach for happiness. Chapter 16. The Unseen Enemy. The fragile peace, the stolen moments of intimacy between Emmeline and Roderick were shattered by a sudden, unexpected blow. A messenger arrived from the capital, bearing a royal decree, a summons for Emmeline to return to court, to answer for new charges. The Queen, it seemed, had not given up. She had found another weapon, another way to attack, another accusation to hurl at Emmeline. The details were vague, deliberately ambiguous, but the threat was clear. Emmeline was still in danger, still a target, still caught in the Queen's web. Emmeline felt a cold dread wash over her. She had hoped, foolishly, that the destruction of the tapestry fragment, the silencing of the old woman, would have bought her some time, some respite. But the Queen was relentless, her determination to destroy her unwavering. Roderick, standing beside her, read the decree, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. He knew, as Emmeline did, that this was not just a summons, but a trap, a carefully laid snare designed to ensnare her, to condemn her, to eliminate her once and for all. "What are the charges?" Emmeline asked, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze meeting Roderick's. "They do not say," Roderick replied, his voice low and angry. "They speak of new evidence, of witnesses, of treason." "But what evidence?" Emmeline pressed. "What witnesses?" "I have done nothing." Roderick shook his head. "It does not matter," he said. "The Queen will fabricate whatever she needs. She will find witnesses who will lie, she will produce documents that are forged, she will create the evidence to support her accusations." Emmeline felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped, caught in a game she could not win, facing an enemy who held all the cards, who controlled the rules, who was determined to destroy her. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze pleading with Roderick for guidance, for support, for hope. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm, strong, his touch reassuring. "We fight," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We do not surrender. We do not give in. We fight." But how? How could they fight an enemy who was so powerful, so ruthless, so invisible? The Queen was like a shadow, a phantom, a presence that could not be seen, but whose power could be felt, whose influence reached into every corner of the kingdom. "We need to know what she has," Roderick said, his voice thoughtful, his mind racing, searching for a strategy, a plan, a way to counter the Queen's attack. "We need to know what evidence she claims to possess, who her witnesses are, what her plan is." They needed an informant, a spy, someone within the court, someone close to the Queen, someone who could provide them with information, with intelligence, with a warning. But who? Who could they trust? Who would be willing to risk their own life, their own position, to help them? Roderick had contacts, former allies, people who owed him favors, people who might be willing to assist. But it was a dangerous game, a risky proposition. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, could lead to their downfall. "There is someone," Roderick said finally, his voice hesitant, his gaze meeting Emmeline's. "Someone who might be able to help." He spoke of a lady of the court, a woman of influence, a woman who had once been close to the Queen, but who had fallen out of favor, a woman who harbored a resentment, a grudge, a desire for revenge. "Lady Isolde of Ashworth," Roderick said. "She is ambitious, cunning, dangerous. But she also hates the Queen. And she might be willing to help us if the price is right." It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice. But they had no other choice. They had to take the risk, to trust this woman, to hope that her hatred of the Queen was stronger than her fear of the consequences. They had to act before the Queen's unseen hand struck again, and destroyed all they had. Chapter 17. Trials by Firelight. Contacting Lady Isolde of Ashworth was a delicate, dangerous operation. Roderick, using his network of informants and clandestine messengers, arranged a secret meeting, a rendezvous in a secluded location, far from the prying eyes of the court. The meeting place was an abandoned hunting lodge, deep in the forest, a place of shadows and secrets, a fitting setting for the treacherous game they were playing. Emmeline and Roderick arrived under the cover of darkness, their movements cautious, their senses alert. Lady Isolde was already there, waiting for them. She was a striking woman, her beauty sharp and angular, her eyes cold and calculating, her demeanor haughty and imperious. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson velvet, her jewels glittering in the dim light of the single lantern that illuminated the room. She greeted them with a curt nod, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, measuring their worth. She was not a woman to be trifled with, a woman who demanded respect, a woman who held her power like a weapon. "So," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but edged with steel, "you are the disgraced knight and the accused traitor. What brings you to my humble abode?" Roderick stepped forward, his voice calm and steady, his manner respectful but firm. "We seek your assistance, Lady Isolde," he said. "We believe you may be able to help us." She raised a delicate eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Help you?" she repeated. "And why would I do that? What is in it for me?" Emmeline spoke then, her voice clear and confident, her gaze meeting Lady Isolde's. "We can offer you information," she said. "Information that could be valuable to you. Information that could damage the Queen." Lady Isolde's eyes narrowed, her interest piqued. "Information?" she said. "What kind of information?" They told her then, carefully, cautiously, revealing only what was necessary, holding back the most sensitive details, testing her reaction, gauging her trustworthiness. They spoke of the Queen's new accusations, of the fabricated evidence, of the false witnesses, of the plot to destroy Emmeline. Lady Isolde listened in silence, her face impassive, her eyes betraying nothing. When they had finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, her mind clearly racing, calculating the risks, weighing the potential benefits. "And what do you want from me?" she asked finally, her voice sharp and direct. "We want to know what the Queen has," Roderick said. "We want to know her plan. We want to know who her witnesses are, what evidence she intends to present. We want a warning." Lady Isolde smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Emmeline's spine. "You ask for much," she said, "and you offer little. We offer you the chance to strike back at the Queen," Emmeline said, her voice firm and unwavering. "To avenge yourself. To regain your position." Lady Isolde's smile widened, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in her eyes. "You are bold, Lady Dunmore," she said, "and perhaps foolish. But I am intrigued." She agreed finally to help them, but her price was high. She demanded not only information, but also protection. She wanted their assurance that they would shield her from the Queen's wrath, that they would defend her if her involvement became known. It was a dangerous bargain, a pact with a woman who was as treacherous as she was ambitious. But they had no choice. They needed her help, her access, her knowledge of the Queen's inner circle. They agreed to her terms, sealing the agreement with a handshake, a silent oath, a bond forged in the shadows, a conspiracy against the crown. As they left the hunting lodge, returning to the darkness of the forest, Emmeline felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had secured an ally, a powerful informant, but they had also made a dangerous enemy. They had stepped further into the Queen's web, deeper into the labyrinth of court intrigue, closer to the truth and to their own destruction. They had to be careful, to use the information Lady Isolde gave with discernment. The trial by firelight, the meeting had tested them. Chapter 18. The Serpent's Fangs. Lady Isolde proved to be a valuable, if unsettling, ally. True to her word, she provided Emmeline and Roderick with crucial information, details of the Queen's plot, the names of the false witnesses, the nature of the fabricated evidence. The Queen, it seemed, had been meticulous in her planning. She had woven a complex web of lies, of half-truths, of manipulated facts, designed to ensnare Emmeline, to portray her as a traitor, a conspirator, a threat to the crown. The new evidence was a series of forged letters, purportedly written by Emmeline to Lord Beaumont, outlining a detailed plan for rebellion, for the overthrow of the king, for the installation of a new puppet ruler. The letters were cleverly crafted, mimicking Emmeline's handwriting, incorporating details of her life, her relationships, her movements, that made them appear authentic. The witnesses were a collection of disgruntled servants, bribed courtiers, and ambitious rivals, all of whom had been promised rewards, favors, and positions of power in exchange for their false testimony. They were prepared to swear, under oath, that they had seen Emmeline consorting with the Queen's enemies, that they had heard her plotting treason, that they had witnessed her disloyalty. It was a formidable case, a carefully constructed trap, designed to destroy Emmeline, to eliminate her as a threat, to silence her forever. Armed with this knowledge, Emmeline and Roderick began to prepare their defense, to counter the Queen's accusations, to expose the lies, to fight for their survival. It was a daunting task, a seemingly impossible challenge, but they were determined to face it, to stand together, to resist. They worked tirelessly, poring over the forged letters, identifying inconsistencies, uncovering flaws, finding evidence that could be used to discredit the Queen's claims. They sought out their own witnesses, loyal servants, trusted friends, people who could testify to Emmeline's integrity, to her loyalty, to her innocence. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to unravel the Queen's web before it ensnared them, before it choked the life out of them. The day of the trial arrived, a cold, gray dawn that mirrored the mood of dread and anticipation that hung over the court. Emmeline, dressed in a simple gown of dark blue, her hair braided and unadorned, stood before the king, the queen, and the assembled courtiers, her head held high, her expression calm and composed. The charges were read, the accusations hurled, the evidence presented. The forged letters were displayed, the false witnesses paraded, their lies echoing through the hall, their testimony a damning indictment of Emmeline's character, her actions, her loyalty. Emmeline listened in silence, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, searching for a way to counter the lies, to expose the truth, to save herself. Roderick, standing beside her, was her only visible support, his presence a silent reassurance, his strength a source of courage. He could not speak for her, could not defend her openly, but his eyes, his touch, his unwavering belief in her, gave her the strength to persevere. When it was her turn to speak, Emmeline rose, her voice clear and steady, her gaze meeting the king's, the queen's, the eyes of the assembled courtiers. "I am innocent," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "These charges are false. This evidence is fabricated. These witnesses are liars." She presented her defense, meticulously, carefully, dismantling the Queen's case piece by piece, exposing the inconsistencies, the flaws, the lies. She called her own witnesses, loyal servants, trusted friends, who testified to her character, her integrity, her loyalty. But it was not enough. The Queen's influence was too strong, her control over the court too absolute. The courtiers, fearful of her wrath, were unwilling to speak out, to challenge her authority, to defend Emmeline. The king, swayed by the Queen's machinations, by the weight of the fabricated evidence, by the testimony of the false witnesses, was leaning towards a verdict of guilty. Emmeline felt a sense of despair wash over her. She had fought, she had resisted, she had failed. The Queen's fangs had sunk deep, her poison spreading through the court, her victory inevitable. Chapter 19. A Knight's Redemption. Just as the king was about to pronounce his verdict, a voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the hushed silence of the court. "I object." It was Roderick. He stepped forward, his tall figure commanding attention, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger, his voice filled with a defiance that shook the very foundations of the hall. He had been silent throughout the trial, unable to speak, forbidden to defend Emmeline openly. But he could remain silent no longer. He could not stand by and watch as the woman he loved, the woman he had sworn to protect, was condemned to a fate she did not deserve. "You object?" the king said, his voice incredulous, his eyes narrowing with anger. "On what grounds, former knight? You have no standing here. You have no right to speak." "I have the right to speak the truth," Roderick said, his voice unwavering. "And the truth is that this trial is a sham, a mockery of justice, a travesty." He denounced the Queen, accusing her openly of fabricating evidence, of bribing witnesses, of plotting to destroy Emmeline for her own personal gain. He spoke of the forged letters, of the false testimony, of the queen's relentless pursuit of power, of her ruthless ambition, of her cruelty. It was a bold, reckless act, a defiance of the crown, a betrayal of his former oath. But he did not care. He had chosen his path, had made his decision, had found his redemption. The court was stunned into silence. The courtiers, shocked by Roderick's outburst, by his accusations, by his courage, watched in stunned disbelief. The queen, her face a mask of fury, rose from her throne, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You dare," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You dare to accuse me?" "I dare to speak the truth," Roderick said, his gaze meeting hers unwavering. "And the truth is that you're a liar, a manipulator, a tyrant." He turned to the king, his voice pleading, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Your Majesty," he said, "I implore you, see the truth. Do not be swayed by her lies, by her manipulations. Lady Dunmore is innocent. She is a loyal subject, a woman of honor, a victim of the queen's ambition." The king, shaken by Roderick's outburst, by his accusations, by the sheer force of his conviction, hesitated. He looked at Emmeline, at Roderick, at the queen, his mind clearly torn, his judgment wavering. He had always trusted Roderick, had valued his loyalty, his integrity, his judgment. He had never known him to lie, to deceive, to betray his oath. But the queen's influence was strong, her power over him profound. He was caught between his trust in Roderick and his fear of the queen, between his sense of justice and his self-preservation. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, the tension in the room almost unbearable. The fate of Emmeline, of Roderick, of the kingdom itself, hung in the balance. It was, at long last, a show of a knight's valor not on the battlefield, but within a court. Roderick, disrobed of title, found honor in the truth. Chapter 20. The Queen's Reckoning. The king's internal struggle was visible, his face a map of conflicting emotions, his eyes darting between Emmeline, Roderick, and the queen. The silence of the court was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the torches, the faint whispers of the courtiers, the pounding of hearts filled with fear and anticipation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the king spoke, his voice low and hesitant, his words measured and deliberate. "I do not know what to believe," he said, his voice filled with doubt and uncertainty. "I am torn. I see the evidence. I hear the testimony, but I also hear your words, Roderick. And I cannot ignore them." He ordered a recess, a temporary suspension of the trial, a chance for him to reflect, to consider, to seek the truth. He commanded that Emmeline and Roderick be confined to separate chambers, under guard, while he deliberated. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was also a sign of hope. The king had not condemned Emmeline outright. He had listened to Roderick, had been swayed by his words, had questioned the queen's accusations. Emmeline, escorted to her chamber, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had been spared, for now, but her fate was still uncertain, still hanging in the balance. She was grateful to Roderick for his courage, for his loyalty, for his love. But she also feared for him, for the consequences of his actions, for the price he might have to pay for his defiance. Roderick, confined to his own chamber, felt a similar mixture of emotions. He had spoken the truth, had defended Emmeline, had risked everything. But he had no regrets. He had done what he believed was right, had followed his conscience, had found his redemption. The hours passed slowly, filled with a tense, unsettling quiet. Emmeline and Roderick, separated by walls of stone, but united in their hearts, waited, prayed, hoped. Finally, the summons came. The king had reached his decision. Emmeline and Roderick were escorted back to the great hall, their hearts pounding, their minds racing, their fates uncertain. The king sat on his throne, his face grave, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. The queen stood beside him, her face a mask of cold fury, her eyes burning with hatred. "I have considered the evidence," the king said, his voice strong and clear, his gaze sweeping over the assembled courtiers. "I have heard the testimony. I have listened to my conscience." He paused, his gaze settling on Emmeline. "Lady Dunmore," he said, "I find you not guilty." A collective gasp of surprise and relief swept through the hall. Emmeline felt a wave of emotion wash over her, so intense that her knees almost buckled. She had been spared, vindicated, her name cleared, her honor restored. But the king was not finished. He turned his gaze to the queen, his eyes filled with a cold, hard anger. "And you, Isolde," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have deceived me. You have manipulated me. You have abused your power." He accused her openly of fabricating evidence, of bribing witnesses, of plotting to destroy Emmeline for her own personal gain. He stripped her of her position, her influence, her power. The queen, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and fear, tried to protest, to deny the accusations, but her words were drowned out by the king's fury, by the murmurs of the courtiers, by the weight of the truth. Her reign of terror was over. Her web of lies had been unraveled. Her ambition had been thwarted. Her reckoning had come. The queen was banished. Emmeline and Roderick, cleared, stared at one another across the suddenly silent hall. The trial was done. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of quiet contentment. Emmeline, restored to her position, her honor intact, ruled Dunmore with wisdom and compassion, her leadership guided by the lessons she had learned, the scars she had borne, the love she had found. Roderick, though stripped of his former title, found a new purpose, a new sense of belonging, at Emmeline's side. He became her advisor, her confidant, her partner in all things. He used his skills, his knowledge, his experience to help her govern, to protect her people, to build a better future. The king, humbled by his near miscarriage of justice and shamed by his wife's treachery, sought to make amends. He restored Roderick's lands, though not his title, recognizing his inherent nobility, his unwavering loyalty, not to the crown, but to the truth. Roderick, however, chose to remain at Dunmore, his allegiance now firmly with Emmeline, his heart bound to hers. They never spoke openly of the queen, of the trial, of the dark days that had almost destroyed them. The memories were too painful, the scars too deep. But they lived with the consequences, with the knowledge that they had survived, that they had triumphed, that they had found each other. Their love, born in the shadows of conspiracy and betrayal, blossomed in the light of their shared survival, their mutual respect, their unwavering devotion. It was not a passionate, fiery romance, but a deep, abiding affection, a quiet understanding, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. One crisp autumn evening, years after the trial, Emmeline and Roderick stood together on the battlements of Dunmore Castle, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The air was cool, the wind gentle, the world around them peaceful and serene. Emmeline leaned against Roderick, her body fitting perfectly against his, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his presence a comforting anchor, his love a silent promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Emmeline asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Your choice? Your sacrifice?" Roderick turned to her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her skin. "Never," he said, his voice low and husky. "I would do it all again, 1,000 times, if it meant being with you." He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a gentle kiss, a tender affirmation, a silent vow of a love that had endured, that had triumphed, that would last forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, but the warmth of their love, the light of their hope, remained, a beacon in the darkness, a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the enduring strength of the heart's rebellion. The quiet years stretched ahead, filled with a gentle promise. They were home,